good teachers are doing these things. Good teachers are scaffolding. Good teachers are chunking. Good teachers are seeing the kid with the hoodie on in the back of the classroom that doesn't have an IEP, but clearly is scared out of their mind and not making that kid stand up. There are good teachers who are doing those things.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. All kids are unique, but some do better in typical classroom settings than others. The process of recognizing that a kid has special academic needs can be frustrating and stressful for parents, educators, professionals, and the student. Unfortunately, the recognition is often just the beginning. The meetings and myriad terms, initials, and acronyms that follow a diagnosis can be confusing and intimidating. In this episode, I'm going to address one of the more common ones, the IEP, or the Individualized Education Program. To help explain the IEP, I've enlisted the help of Kimberly Robinson. Kim came highly recommended to me because of her over 20 years of experience working as a speech language pathologist and her expertise formulating and monitoring IEPs. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I was asked to babysit when I was younger, and they had a special needs child there, pretty significantly cognitively delayed, physically in a wheelchair. And I just felt sort of helpless. And I felt a lot of compassion for this individual. And there was just something that kind of struck me that made me think, this is something I want to do. I want to help in some way. So maybe somewhere that's kind of what led me to the speech language pathology program in New York. I did my undergraduate SUNY New Paltz, which is a state school in New York. And then I worked for a few years. And then I got my master's at New York Medical College in Valhalla. And I did center-based therapy for a while. I worked in some pediatric hospitals for a while.
Okay.
And then I moved to Arizona. And that's when I was going to start a family and whatnot. And it just, the school seemed to be a better fit for me at that time. So that's when I started working in education.
You know, obviously, the topic of this podcast is IEPs. And IEP is one of those set of initials that we hear so much in education that I think many people are even afraid to ask what it means because it seems so omnipresent. Can you describe what an IEP is?
So an IEP is an acronym for Individualized Education Plan, and it's a living, breathing document. And it's a document whereby it's given to a student who has challenges with a typical curriculum, a general curriculum. So within this working document, we have a student's strengths, and then we have a student's challenges. And then we, as a team, a multidisciplinary team, and there are several members of that team, I can get into that in a minute, come up with a plan as to how we're going to meet the needs of this student. Essentially, how can we level the playing field for this student so that they're able to work at the same level or somewhat at the same level as their general education peers. So that's kind of the ideal. But prior to even getting an individual education plan, there has to be something called a MET evaluation, which is a multidisciplinary evaluation. So before an IEP can even be developed, you have to have a MET. So the MET is a meeting whereby the team members, so depending on what level the student is receiving the IEP, the team members could vary. So if you're looking at a preschooler, you would look at the psychologist would be on the team, the speech language pathologist,
Okay.
the preschool teacher, possibly an occupational or physical therapist, or both. You might actually also have that would pretty much cover it at the preschool level. And then as you get through the grades, you might have counselors involved. You might have
Okay.
whoever, and parents are always involved. So they're
Okay.
always part of the multidisciplinary team. So you have what you call as a Met one, where you, as a team, determine, okay, do we need to gather more information to determine if this individual needs an IEP? Because
Okay.
once an IEP is developed, that means you're in the realm of special education. Ideally, the goal is you want to keep students out of special education. So even prior to the MET, what we do is called response to intervention. So prior to even going to the MET process and the IEP process, we want to try to implement modifications and accommodations within the classroom to help
Okay.
a student so that we don't necessarily have to go the route of special education. So we'll try all of these things first, and then we'll have that first MET evaluation, and we'll say, hey, these strategies, they did work, they did not work. They did not work. Okay, what areas are we seeing challenges? So from there, we'll have the psychologist who will do a battery of tests. So cognitive tests,
Okay.
nonverbal assessments, and the speech language pathologist early on is usually one of the also uh, people that administer standardized assessments as well. So then you'll have the speech language pathologist administering a standardized assessment. And then you might also need an occupational therapy assessment or a physical therapy assessment. So after all the assessments are done, we have another meeting called the MET 2, where
Okay.
the results are discussed. And that is when the determination is met by the team if we are going to go the IEP route.
Okay.
So this is where, in certain situations, you could look at a student who maybe they just need something called a 504, which is we're not moving into the realm of special education. Maybe the student just needs additional accommodations and modifications in their classroom. So maybe this is a student with ADHD
Okay.
and they do really well in the general curriculum, but they need extra time on assessments. They might need, a copy of their notes, because an additional copy of notes. Just again, something to kind of level the playing field. There's nothing wrong with their cognition. They can
Mm.
handle the material. It's just I have ADHD and I need additional support. So there are things like that. And then if we determine, okay, well, this individual needs more support than a 504 can provide, that's when we develop an IEP.
Okay.
And that's where we have the individual education plan. And that's what's the huge piece. It's an individual education plan. It's individualized for every single student. So we can mold it, craft it to whatever a student needs in order to um, get them to be as successful as they can be within a comprehensive campus.
So I have a lot of questions.
Sure.
I want to start with the something you said early on, which is we want to keep kids away from having an IEP because that puts them in the realm of special education. Why do you want to keep kids out of special education?
Well, special education is phenomenal in a lot of ways, but also once you're in special education, you the class sizes are smaller. You
Hmm.
tend to be with the same students, so you're kind of
Mm.
kind of maneuvering with the same students. Um, we want students to have we want to provide the least restrictive environment possible, right?
Okay.
So an IEP is going to be restrictive, and then depending on what a student needs, so within the IEP there are also levels. There's a lot. The IEP is
Right.
such a
Right.
so much going on, so there's levels of service too. So ideally, if a student can get away with just having accommodations and modifications within their classroom, and we can identify that, that's what we want. We want these students to be as independent as possible, because special education, there's a lot of hands on.
Right.
So there's a lot of hands in the pot. So if we can have a student that can handle things on their own and can be successful with, just like I said, the modifications, accommodations we could provide from a 504 or the interventions prior to, then that's phenomenal.
Got it.
Um, so that's what I mean. It's not like a stigma to have an IEP, But if kids can do it on their own, we really want them to be successful without the IEP.
You'd also mentioned that there was this Met One meeting, and you talked about all the people that were there. You mentioned the psychologist. Just to clarify, that's a psychologist that's being provided by the school district, correct?
Mhm.
And they're doing these assessments, and these assessments are being done. The parent isn't necessarily paying for these assessments, correct?
No, these are all free assessments, and the parent is one of the big major players of the team. So
Right.
we have to get written consent to get to assess their children. Um, but yeah, these are free assessments. So school-based assessments are free, and we even offer prior to preschool Head Start programs and whatnot to identify potential speech and language or any kind of potential delays prior to even coming into preschool. So we can try to um, um, help those parents with kids that are maybe already starting to struggle, but even before even starting school.
So I'm a parent, and I see that my child is struggling, and other members of the team, other people from her school or his school have said, they might benefit from these different accommodations, and we go beyond the accommodations and we start to have these meetings that you talk about.
Mhm,
I can see where going into a meeting like that with all those people around the table, people that I probably haven't met before,
mhm.
that could be quite terrifying, right? Is what sort of advice or what can we tell parents to kind of ease their anxiety about walking into that first Met One meeting?
It's interesting. I always think about it from the perspective of the professional and how we want to try to ease our parents into these situations. But let me think about it from a perspective of a parent. I really honestly think it's very much the onus of the team
Yeah,
to try to alleviate the anxiety of the parent. They should be all of a sudden, hey, your kid has da 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 da. It should
yeah,
be done in a way where it sort of piecemeal. So a lot of times, if you're looking at a preschooler, speech is going to be the first professional who's going to maybe notice some differences.
hmm,
So it might be the speech therapist saying, "Hey, I've noticed this," and maybe chatting with the parent before jumping into the full battery of meetings. So hopefully that the parent has had an opportunity to kind of meet the people in the team, so
okay,
that alleviates some of the concerns, or not concerns, but alleviates some of the anxiety, because it is scary to walk into a meeting with all these professionals at a table, and they're talking about your kid, and they're talking about potentially really scary and sad things that they're not in a place or ready to listen hear or had no
right,
idea, or they're just there's so many emotions. I feel like being a preschool speech language pathologist was probably one of the more challenging,
mm,
because that was I tended to be one of the first people saying, hey, I'm noticing characteristics that are likened to possibly autism or this
yeah,
sort of a thing,
yeah.
and it can be challenging. So you really have to kind of find that line where you're being honest and you're being forthright with the child's needs, but not giving the parent so much information where they're drowning and they don't know what to do next. So it's really, yeah, it's hard, especially those early years for
Well,
sure.
it's so personal by definition. If you're a
Oh
parent
gosh.
walking into anytime you're advocating on behalf of your child, it's natural to feel judged.
Hmm.
That your child is an extension of you, and so if the school is saying that my child has different needs, what are they thinking about me? The parent might be
Hmm.
thinking that, right? It's also frightening, because
Hmm.
you're dealing with this team, and the people that you mentioned, speech pathologists like yourself, psychologists, other school officials. These can be very intimidating people to parents, especially parents that might have not have had the greatest academic experience themselves, right?
Hmm.
Can feel even a little dangerous, a little threatening sometimes, right?
Hmm.
So, what sort of rights do parents have when they're in these meetings? Is this just something where the school is like, yeah, this is what we're going to do to your kid? and we just wanted to put you on notice.
No, not at all. So, like I said, the parent is very much made aware every step of the way. We have a parental book of rights that were
Hmm.
given to the parents numerous times, and that we can go over with the parents. And we reiterate that this is a working document, and your opinion and everything you say matters. And if parents are not in agreement, they're not in agreement.
Right.
So all we can say do is say, hey, these are the things we're noticing. Have you noticed these things as well?
Right.
And often there's prior to even the evaluation, the met we will get a background report too. So even before we get to the IEP part, we've already had either the psychologist or myself going through background information, kind of starting the process, so we
Hmm.
can kind of start slowly letting the parents into kind of what's going on. And quite frankly, before the big meetings, like when if I have the one-on-one with the background history or the psychologist, you kind of get to know if the parent maybe had learning problems, and they're like,
Hmm.
oh wow, um, yeah, that's something that happened to me too, and I didn't really get any help, and it was at school was really a struggle. So I'm happy that Bobby's going to
Mm.
get the help. Or so you see that quite frequently. You see, oh, I didn't know what to do, or yes, I noticed this, or oh wow, I didn't realize this wasn't typical.
Okay.
Um, so a lot of times you do get the parents that are very much regardless of kind of how they're approached, even when they've kind of had the diagnosis, or their child has been in special education. There still is that those there's still it's still very challenging to sometimes be realistic about where your child is, because it is so
Right, but I
such a
really
part of your heart,
appreciate
right?
that. Yeah, I mean, but I really appreciate your observation, and oftentimes parents are learning something about themselves or their own
Mhm.
relationship with learning. And so at least some of the people you've worked with have seen this as an opportunity to prevent their child from experiencing something that was harmful to them. So I think that's a really positive thing. You know, I do
Or
know that
even
there
giving
are, yeah,
them
please.
well, or even give them strategies. Maybe strategies they and that's another big thing is parent involvement. As when I
Right.
because I've done all sorts of different avenues of therapy. I've done home care as well. I think I forgot to mention that. So that's a really great way to work with parents. You're in there one on one. So you're working with parent
Mm,
education. And so teaching parents strategies and things to help with those skills to move to move their kids along. And so they feel empowered as well. So that's a really great thing, is empowering these parents and saying, hey, yeah, this is happening, but look it, we're catching this early, or we found this out, and hey, we
right.
have a plan so that we can help Bobby get through this X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is. So yeah, it's
And I know that you've mentioned a couple of these things, but maybe it's kind of useful to run through them. What are some of the things that might be extended to a student through the IEP process? So we've already mentioned they might have some sort of accommodations, which they're allowed more times for tests, but they might be allowed additional materials. What maybe smaller class size? What other sorts of
mhm.
accommodations might be afforded students through this process?
So again, it's an individual education plan.
Hmm.
So you look at the student and you really look and see, okay, I'm trying to think of more of the out of the box kind of accommodations that we've. So for example, right now I work on a comprehensive high school campus, but I also have a job where I'm working with students who have received all their credits, but now we are working in a transition workplace scenario. So
Okay.
they still have an IEP, but the goals are different, the accommodations are different, the modifications are different. So now we're not looking at it as academic modifications and accommodations. We're looking at workplace. What will they need in the
Oh,
workplace? So it's an IEP is, what is this person going to need
right.
now? What do they need now? So maybe freshman year they needed to be have preferential seating, and they maybe needed to have um, uh, information chunked, and maybe they needed to have vocabulary defined, or maybe they
Right.
needed to have visuals or copies of notes,
Okay.
whatever it is. But maybe the next year they don't need that, and or maybe midway through the year they don't need that. So we don't need to use those accommodations. It just matters where they are, what program they're in, and what they need, and we can
Hmm.
basically streamline it to fit whatever they need.
So you're saying it might be as simple as changing how information gets presented in a class, changing
Hmm.
how much information is presented at one, that
Exactly.
chunking that might happen. And it's the case, as you mentioned, that this is, and it was one of the very first things you said, it's a living document. And so it's not
Hmm.
something where if this is what we're doing now, that's what we're always going to be doing for the student. It might change.
Exactly. Hmm. It's very dynamic. So whatever the student needs at any given time. And we have quarterly progress reports. And if a parent calls a meeting, or if
Hmm.
a teacher calls a meeting, hey, this is happening, or hey, this great thing's happening, or no, hey, maybe we need to look at this, and um, these accommodations don't seem to be working in this class. What do we need to do? What do we need to tweak? I find at the high school level, a lot of things I work on is executive functioning. So initiating tasks, organization,
Right.
planning. My students, they have such trouble with those kinds of things. So it's 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 whatever it is they may need.
Right.
So I have kids that have fluency. So
Hmm.
maybe it's me providing teachers with um, environmental modifications. So if they have a student who has a severe stutter, you maybe don't require them to answer open-ended
Right.
questions at that time, or maybe you don't have them stand up in front of the class and and answer.
Right.
So things like that. So it's just a map again. It's a living, breathing document. We look at the student, and as a team, we just figure out what can we do? What can we do to help this kid be successful?
And I know that, as you mentioned, the IEP is kind of the final or one of the final formal things that can happen in this process.
Hmm.
But my understanding is they're not actually that rare, right? For a parent who's thinking, "Oh my goodness, mine is the only child at the school that has an IEP.
Hmm.
They're standing out. They're going to be stigmatized." In the schools that you work with, how many kids have IEPs?
I have a caseload of about 85.
Yeah.
So, and that's just speech. So I think currently here we have, I think it's under 200. We have here on campus
Right.
students with IEP. So yeah, it is common. It's
Right.
not an uncommon thing, and it's becoming more common because it's become more discussed, because our students are also included within the comprehensive
Right.
campus. So
Right.
um, I think the gen which would be ideal on any comprehensive campus, is to have our special education included, and that's kind of what
Mhm.
we try to do. So I know parents might think there's a stigma attached with having an IEP, but I find that that's becoming less.
Okay.
And if a student desperately needs it, then obviously it's the best option.
The other term you use, which I also, very much liked, is you talked about the team that's there for the child. Are parents allowed to bring people from outside of the school system in with them? So, for example, if their child already has a therapist in the community, is that person allowed to be a part of this IEP process?
We welcome that because we also we have students that live in group homes. We
Mm,
have students that, like you said, get private therapy. Students that have respite. We have parents that like to bring advocates in,
mm,
or lawyers. Some parents just like to start off that way,
mhm.
and some. So we welcome anybody and everybody. You just let us know, and they are welcome to come to the meeting.
And do you think that these advocates, these attorneys that people bring in, do they help the process or do they hinder the process, in your opinion?
Both.
Okay,
I think
kind of
um,
depends,
I
right?
think we have some really phenomenal advocates, and I think they are definitely needed in certain circumstances. And I think in other circumstances, um, it's overkill,
Mm,
because I think you're not giving the team the chance to state their case and
right.
provide you with what the plan is, before already assuming that you're not going to be able to um, to provide it.
Gotcha.
So, but then there are situations where there are teams that aren't doing what they're supposed to do. They're not following the IEP. So, in that case, yes, an advocate, I would as a parent myself, I would
Right.
definitely bring an advocate. If I have a document, it's a legal document, and you're not following this legal document after we as a team created it and developed it together, then
Yeah.
yes, I will be bringing somebody that's going to reinforce that. So, I mean, it makes perfect. And I'm fine either way, because I feel like if you have your ducks in a row and you're doing the best for the student, then you're going to be fine.
So, in addition to listening to the team that's already in place, in addition to bringing in those outside resources that maybe team members that already know the student, any other tips that you have for parents that might be starting this process?
I would say, let me think. I'm thinking more along the lines of parents that are, it's typically going to be, with students that are younger,
Hmm.
that usually rarely, I mean, it does happen where you get an IEP later on in your education, but usually it's earlier on. So I would say, goodness, have the team make sure to give you a copy
Okay.
of the IEP at least a week before the meeting so that you can go over it yourself or bring it to somebody that you trust and kind of review it. So if you have any questions prior to the meeting, or you can even call prior to the meeting, say, "Hey, I don't understand what this is."
Mm,
You could call anybody on the team. Could you explain what this is before we have the meeting? Or I have questions about this. I'd say do your homework. So
right.
ask for the IEP up front or the MET report, which would be the evaluation. You would want that too. All of the standardized assessments that qualified the student for the IEP, to review that beforehand. And like I said, if you're having trouble reviewing it, try to find somebody that can help you. There are
Okay.
places you could probably go. And then also we also have bilingual. We have translators, so we can translate an IEP into almost any language
Oh,
or
that's
have
wonderful.
someone to
Right.
call. Yeah.
Right. And because that can also be terribly, terribly scary for
Oh,
people
so
who
scary.
are right are speaking English as a second language going into that.
Yeah.
And there's also different
Yeah.
dynamics with the school. I would be amiss if I didn't express my bias here ever so slightly. Whenever we talk,
Okay.
and whenever I talk to other professionals about IEPs and accommodations, and I hear things like, "Well, what we can do for a child is, we can track the learning, we can adjust the learning so it matches how they need to take in information." And I always think, I want to do that for every kid. I don't want an IEP for this, right? If it
Right.
needs to be chunked, let's chunk it for everybody. If they're like, let's not make anybody stand up in front of the class and do something, regardless of whether or not they have a stutter. Let's like pay attention and meet all the kids where they are, so that we can help all of them get to where they need to be. But that's just me on a soapbox there, Kim. That's all that is.
No, but I agree that I agree, and I think, well, I work strictly in special education, so I'm
Right.
in the resource classrooms. I'm not really in the general education. So if I have a student in there that doesn't get speech, it's not like I'm like, "Oh, no, don't talk
Right.
to me. I'm not gonna help
Right.
you." But
Right.
like, but I do see teachers, good teachers are doing these things. Good teachers are scaffolding. Good teachers are chunking. Good teachers are seeing the kid with the hoodie on in the back of the classroom that doesn't have an IEP, but clearly is scared out of their mind and not
Right.
making that kid stand up. There are good teachers who are doing those things. But also have to say, as public education, the way it's presented,
Yeah.
it's challenging for the way a lot of our kids learn.
Yeah.
It's just not the best for all of our different learners. So really it's up to us as educators to try to find ways within the confines of public education
Right.
to to help these kids, um, do the best that they can.
Well, Kim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to my listeners today, and to kind of reveal a little bit about the IEP process. If they're going through it, hopefully they will be a little bit more at ease. But thank you, and also thanks for all that you do for our students. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was great. I had a great time.
That was Kimberly Robinson. For more information about Kim, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young children, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.